Good morning, everyone. I see someone has already started recording. That's interesting. Okay, let's just jump straight into chapter 18. Some part of this I might leave as self-study, the very last sections of this chapter. That is the intergovernmental issues in South Africa. But it is important that you do go through those sections as well. Okay, so we started talking about the assignment of different functions to different levels of subnational government on Friday. Lungako, did you have a question? Lungako, did you want to ask something? Not? Okay. I thought I saw you speaking. Anyway, so we started talking about which functions get assigned to which levels of government, typically, and why it's desirable to assign certain functions to certain levels. And I think we left off at tax competition versus tax harmonization. And we talked about how tax competition can result in economic distortions and what we call bigger than neighbor policies. That's when you have sort of a race to the bottom in terms of tax rates. So you have different states or provinces, say, trying to outcompete each other in terms of the. Okay, thanks for clarifying. Trying to outcompete each other in terms of tax rates, perhaps to attract tax-paying entities like firms or households or individuals. But it can also result in more efficiency in some instances. In theory, right, where you have different states or provinces or cities competing against each other for in terms of the policy proposals, in terms of the tax rates, and so on. And there's some debate about this. So in the textbook, they talk about how one can see tax competition across subnational governments as something that is both inefficient but also can be efficient. So there's some debate there, and it's actually not clear how we can find examples of both cases, and one only has to look at the international sort of picture to see that sometimes things can go a bit too far in this when it comes to tax competition, where you have a few very small countries that have that appear to be the headquarters for a lot of large multinational corporations, and these corporations are domiciled there only because of the tax rate, because of the favorable tax rates. And I'm talking about Ireland, of course, but there are other countries, some small island states as well, where we observe this happening. And if you follow US politics, like I suppose it's almost impossible not to follow US politics, given how influential the media is, and with social media, etc. It's hard to avoid it, actually. But one of the issues that came up in the last presidential campaign among lots of candidates was this idea of taxing the big corporations, and the argument from the candidates proposing raising taxes on big corporations was that for many of these companies, Amazon, Google, etc., they see that in the US they pay no federal taxes. They pay no taxes to the national government there, zero. despite the fact that there's a 20% tax rate or something. I think it might be 25% at this stage, or between 20 and 25% tax rate in the US, company tax rate. And that's because these companies are domiciled in Ireland, and perhaps in some other countries. Okay, and they pay the lower tax rate there. I think the tax rate in Ireland is something about around 10%, maybe even less than that. And this sort of thing happens at subnational government as well. You do have competition. Again, in the US, as I said last time, is a good example because of they've got 50 states compared to our 9 provinces, and those states can do things a lot differently. Unlike in South Africa, where provinces have sort of very little autonomy in terms of specifically the taxing powers. In the US, it's very different. They can have income tax at the state level, and they have sales taxes at the state level as well, which is like VAT, right? The Western Cape can't impose a VAT. So the US is very interesting, and companies do exploit this. A couple of years ago, Amazon famously put it out there, sort of almost made an offer to different, I think it was states, at the state level. They were they asked states to make proposals to them as a company on where they should set up their headquarters, which was very strange. So they were actually literally asking states to compete against each other to vie for their business. And this is exactly what we're talking about when it comes to tax competition and tax harmonization. Okay, so there are 2 different ways of thinking about this. And in some instances, we observe the inefficient outcomes, and we may also observe competition resulting in more efficiency. That is, if sort of good policies are being suffused throughout the country. But this is perhaps not something that we'll really observe in countries like South Africa, given our political structure and so on, our governance structure. Okay, S&G borrowing powers, subnational government borrowing powers. Okay, so we've talked about taxing, we've talked about different functions, how we assign those across the levels of government. So how do we assign borrowing powers across the different levels, that is national versus subnational? So in general, the capacity for debt issuance is somewhat limited at subnational level when compared to national government. Like I said, that differs across countries. In some countries like the US, countries like Switzerland, much more autonomy at subnational government level, where compared to countries like South Africa, very little capacity to raise debt at subnational government levels, especially the provinces. Slightly different case for municipalities. They've got somewhat more power than provinces, but still limited certainly compared to national government. So where such powers exist among subnational governments, there's usually a supervisory role for national government with respect to debt management. And this is the case even with national government. There's an office in the treasuries of provincial governments that oversee what municipalities in a given province is doing, and that manages their debt. At least that monitors it and advises them, and they have powers to restrict or at least to advise or caution municipalities in terms of their debt. So there's a lot of oversight. So despite the fact that municipalities have debt issuing capabilities, have debt issuing powers, there's a lot of oversight in terms of how they go about this, and there's a lot of restrictions on the capacity to raise debt, which is why we don't observe, too many crises when it comes to debt, municipal debt in South Africa. In fact, I was at a conference a couple of years ago in which a former National Treasury official told the audience, told the conference that in his view, municipalities are issuing too little debt. They're not exploiting their debt raising capabilities enough. Okay, so this is to ensure that subnational government activities, maybe one of you will write an honest thesis on this next year, on that question. So this is to ensure that subnational government activities align with national macroeconomic objectives. That's one reason why borrowing powers are distributed in this way. Much like debt issuance by national government, subnational government debt issuance does require an active market for debt obligations. And in some states, that's in some countries, that is the case, where you have a very active market for debt at all levels, at national level as well as subnational level. In South Africa, it's different. The market for national debt and the market for municipal debt looks nothing like, they don't look anything like each other. Okay, when debt buyers or lenders believe that a given subnational government will not be able to fully service its debt, they will often sell off bonds, okay, resulting in higher rates, which undercuts subnational government capacity to finance expenditure. All right, so this is why you have this oversight of subnational government debt issuance, is that it can result in instability to public finances if as we're observing at the national level in South Africa presently. But at subnational government, you might observe this this issue, and when that happens at subnational government, that you have a fiscal crisis, a debt crisis at municipal level, then it will usually fall on the national government to step in and try and resolve the issue, or at least to provide some kind of assistance, whether it's directly through taking on the subnational government debt, or through some other means by some kind of in-kind transfer with assisting with negotiations, or just backstopping the debt, right? So guaranteeing the debt, like we do with the SOEs. So such a scenario can give rise to a contagion effect, where subnational governments, not initially thought to have fiscal problems, end up having problems because subnational debt is viewed as risky. So this is analogous to the national situation. So you might recall, following the financial crisis, there was quite a fiscal crisis among some countries, and this gave rise to what we call contagion, where people who trade in and this was largely among emerging markets and some of the lower tier, if one can say that, countries in the European Union, and this is this idea of contagion. So if people who are trading in debt, and these are usually banks, investment banks, and so on, these are the major debt holders, government debt holders. Because government debt is typically perceived to be safe, right, by these entities. And if they observe that a particular country is struggling, they will look at other similar countries and at least be cautious, at least be somewhat weary of the debt level of other similar countries, right? Because there's this idea that if this country is having some difficulty, perhaps there's a systemic issue rather than something unique to a given country. And the same applies with subnational governments, right? Because and it's not something that's it's not an idea it's not folly, right? It's not just a capricious idea. But it is the case that usually when we observe these fiscal crises, that there is something systemic at play, rather than just a government being not being cautious. Although, of course, there is definitely there are definitely situations where that is also true, right? Okay. Now, financial problems in one SNG, given this idea of contagion, can spill over into problems for others. So even if, let's say provinces had borrowing power and Western Cape decides to go crazy and build a bunch of infrastructure, new bridges, roads, spruce up the roads, etc., and they take on a lot of debt to do these things. And it turns out the province can't repay the debt, right? They're not raising enough taxes, they didn't plan properly, etc. And of course, if the Western Cape is taking on debt, other provinces are also taking on debt, right? Because they can. And even if other provinces, say the Eastern Cape, didn't do what we did and go on a spending binge, investors in subnational government debt, in provincial debt, might just be a lot more cautious about buying debt, and through trading they'll put up the prices, or put down the prices, that is. So they'll sell off debt that they perceive to be more risky, which lowers prices, and of course, as you know from your introductory finance course, in turn raises interest rates, and of course that in turn influences the capacity for subnational governments to raise debt, and also influences their finances, because they now have to repay higher debt costs when they issue new debt, and this is becoming a problem for South Africa at the national level, as we saw in our budget this past February. Our debt servicing cost is now something close to our health budget, right? So the government's entire health budget, that's what we're paying in debt service costs right now, which is alarming, actually. Okay, so the issue of contagion is an important consideration when it comes to giving subnational governments debt issuing powers. Okay, now one of the factors that makes contagion possible is information asymmetry between government, whether it's subnational or national, on the one hand, and lenders on the other hand. Okay, so governments might know what the capacity is to repay debt, whereas it's harder for lenders to find out what the capacity is to repay debt, and so there's this information asymmetry, and governments might be inclined to raise debt to the extent that they want to implement certain projects, etc. So recall the idea that, and you might think, why would a government be so irresponsible? Well, you know, these things happen, right? As we observe presently, but in a theoretical sense, why this might happen is that, as we discussed previously, politicians, state officials have an incentive, right? Just like households have an incentive to or desire to maximize utility, firms to maximize profits. Politicians or state officials have an incentive to maximize power. They want to stay in power. They want to attract votes, right, from citizens. And one way of doing that is providing goods and services to citizens, right? So, and if there's debt available that facilitates that process, then they will take on that debt and to provide those goods and services and attract votes. Okay, another potential problem arises when subnational governments depend on grants from national government for a substantial share of expenditure. That's just the case in South Africa. Lenders might then perceive subnational government debt to be, at least implicitly, and sometimes explicitly, guaranteed by national debt. Okay, and I just mentioned this idea earlier, where even though debt is being issued by a municipality, there might be, at the very least, the perception from a lender, lender being a bank, investment bank, there might be the perception, at the very least, that the debt is guaranteed by the national government, and therefore it has a lower risk of default, right? So So a lender is at lower risk of losing money by lending to a subnational government if that is being guaranteed by a national government. So given that, lenders might accept a higher risk, right? And this is known as moral hazard. This is where lenders exploit the fact that their returns are in essence insured by national government, right? At least implicitly. Now, these guarantees may not be explicitly honored, right? So a national government might say, look, there's nothing written in the constitution, there's nothing written in law that says that the national government must step in and take on the debt of a subnational government that cannot honor its debts. But it's rare, and it's politically usually it's politically infeasible to do that. Again, we can look to the US for example, for a good example of this, where it was argued. There were some arguments about helping out states by national government with various expenditures, one of them being debt. Okay, such threats are really credible due to the welfare implications of allowing an SNG to go bankrupt. So even if it is the case that a given country's constitution and the legal governance framework is set up so that municipalities are entirely responsible for their own for repaying debt, and national government has no sort of explicit duty to assist in times of crises, it's nonetheless not always politically feasible, right? And therefore, it's usually not a credible notion that a national government is just going to stand by if a municipality is in trouble and allow them to default, because of, as mentioned in this bullet point, the welfare implications to the citizens of that province. Right? So it's important that any borrowing powers devolve to sub-national government level are regulated and monitored at national level, okay, as is the case here. Okay, so this next slide gives us, just shows us where South Africa rests compared to other countries when it comes to sub-national government debt. So our the red circle over here is where South Africa lies. And what we see is that we have a very low level of subnational government debt as a proportion of total public debt, right? So it's around 10%, which means 90% of all public debt, all government debt in South Africa is at national level, and only 10% is at subnational level. And this is perhaps why the former one, this is one sort of data point that supports the remark by the former Treasury official who suggested that our municipalities, perhaps there's maybe more scope for our municipalities, or at least some of them, to further exploit their debt raising capabilities, right? To promote better infrastructure and so on, and development within municipalities. Because only 10% of total debt is municipal debt. Okay. I forget what the horizontal axis is on this slide. Okay. So, but most of the countries that lie above us appear to be more highly developed countries than in South Africa, right? Somewhat richer countries. And in fact, most countries cluster here in this bottom left corner. So you can see Brazil, for instance, lies below us. So they too have a highly centralized situation when it comes to debt issuing. All right, let's talk about intergovernmental grants. Okay, and this will nicely set up what our subnational funding scheme looks like here in South Africa. Okay, so intergovernmental grants are transfer payments from one sphere of government to another sphere of government. in the South African case, to either provincial or local government. Such grants can be conditional or unconditional. Okay? Conditional meaning that like the funds being transferred from national government to provincial government or municipal government have conditions attached to it in terms of how that money gets spent. Okay. Sometimes there are other types of conditions as well, which we'll talk about along the way. And whereas unconditional grants, on the other hand, have no conditions at all. It's just a direct transfer from national government to provincial, local government, and those subnational governments can use the funds in any way that they please. Okay. All right. Intergovernmental grants can also be differentiated into matching grants or non-matching grants. Okay. So the definitions are given on this slide here. So matching grant is when the national government matches the spending undertaken by subnational government on specific services. Okay, there are examples of this in South Africa. In some aspects of health expenditure and so on, where the subnational government is required to undertake some expenditure on a given activity, a given public good or service, and national government effectively subsidizes the provision of that good or services by some proportion. A non-matching grant, on the other hand, is when national government makes a lump sum payment regardless of the subnational government expenditure. So in the non-matching case, the grant provided by national government is of a given size regardless of how much the subnational government is spending on that good or service. And there are examples of this in South Africa as well. Okay, unconditional non-matching grants. So an unconditional non-matching grant is merely a lump sum transfer to a subnational government with no constraints on how that subnational government is allowed to spend those funds. Okay, so the recipient may spend it on any good or service, or even provide tax relief to citizens, in theory, right? In other words, okay. And this is effectively an income supplement to the subnational government. So in SA, we have the block grant, or what is more commonly called the equitable share. And this is a type of unconditional non-matching grant where a lump sum is transferred to subnational governments, to both provincial and municipal entities, and this can be spent at their discretion. Now, it says at their discretion, but provinces and municipalities don't have all that much scope to. They don't have as much discretion as what might be suggested by that claim, right? That it can be spent entirely at their discretion, because there are certain expenditure assignments that we talked about earlier that act as a binding constraint on the magnitude of any discretion, right? So the space of discretion isn't vast for especially for provinces, right? Because recall the main assignment that they have in terms of the provision of public goods and services is administering health and education. And those are massive. They make up more than 80% typically of provincial budgets. So there isn't much discretion in terms of how they can spend the block grants. Okay, the effect of such a grant on subnational government expenditure is analyzed on following slides. Okay, so here we can graphically, for this maybe I'll go to my other slides. So we can talk about this graphically. On this graph, what you have is a okay. Let me just minimize this one. Look at this one. Okay. So the horizontal axis on this graph is the measure of spending by subnational government on the grant-aided good, right? And that's the case for all the graphs we're going to look at now. So over here we have spending on the grant-aided public good on the horizontal axis. On the vertical axis, we have spending on any other public goods at the subnational government level. Okay, so this is the graph of, this is effectively the budget line of the subnational government, and that budget can be split between grant-aided public goods. Those are public goods and services that national government wants it to spend its transfer funding on, and other public goods and services. So these are all the other activities, public goods and services, other than what's included in what national government prescribes that the subnational government can spend its funding on. Okay. So in the case of an unconditional non-matching grant, remember that's what we call the block grant, and this South Africa's equitable share is an example of this. What happens is that the budget line for the subnational government simply shifts out. Now, by the way, the indifference curves on this graph reflect the median voter preferences. Okay, so you might recall, I think it's from chapter 6 or 7, the idea of the median voter, which is the voter that splits the preferences of a given population, a given citizenry, in half, right? And in theory, politicians to win elections, right, to win the 50% plus one majority, will target the median voter on a given issue, because it's the median voter plus the 50% that will vote in a certain way on a given issue, and thereby afford the politician who promises to meet their preferences a win in a given election. Okay, in a majority voting system, in the 50% plus one government system, electoral system. Okay, so that indifference curve is, you can think of it as society's preferences. Okay, so IO shows that initially this government, the subnational government, spends L on the public good and spends spends L on the public goods other than the grant-aided public good, and spends G on the grant-aided public good. And this could be anything, right? This could be, in the municipal case, something like housing, okay, on the horizontal axis here. So maybe national government wants municipalities to spend more, wants to increase their budget on housing. So they give them a lump sum grant that they want the subnational government to use on housing, but that they don't explicitly tie to that activity, to that public good or service. So the value of the grant given in this case is BD, right? That's the difference between this budget, the initial budget line, AB, and the new budget line, CD. So it's BD or CA. There should be the same value because this line is parallel, just shifts the budget line out, right? And it shifts the budget line out in parallel because the government can spend this funds on grant-aided public good, but also the non-grant-aided public good. Now, what happens here is that the indifference curve just falls more or less on a similar position in terms of its relative distance between the vertical and horizontal axes, right? Because presumably EO reflects public preferences for grant-aided public goods versus other public goods, and E1 is going to reflect similar preferences, right? The higher up indifference curve. It's going to reflect a similar split between grant-aided public good and non-grant-aided public good, right? So the distance between K and L on the vertical axis will be similar to the distance between G and H. But in this case, you have more expenditure on both grant-aided public goods as well as non-grant-aided public goods. So not everything gets spent, right? So the value of the change in the grant-aided public good is not BD, it's less than BD, because some of this expenditure is going to the non-grant-aided public goods, okay? So that's the case of a unconditional non-matching grant. Now let's look at a conditional non-matching grant. Okay, so In the conditional non-matching grant, recall that grants provide recipient subnational governments with funds conditional on these funds being used for a specific service. So in South Africa, examples of these would be the school infrastructure grant, the various types of healthcare grants for healthcare expenditure that are specifically meant for that purpose only. Okay. Okay, so in this case, so you have a similar setup. You have an initial budget line of AB. Now you have a new budget line that has a kink. Okay, so although it's parallel up to this point A, from D to F, there's then a kink and a horizontal line from A to F. So the new budget line is A, F, D rather than CD, right? And that's because of the conditionality of this graph, right? So the subnational government does not have the option to spend more to use this grant, these grant funds, this transfer, to spend more on goods and services other than the grant-aided public good. Okay, that's not an option, which is why you have that horizontal line from A to F. Okay, but it has to use the value of that grant on the grant-aided public good. But what we notice here is that the value of the grant again is BD, expenditure on the grant-aided public good. However, despite the fact that the grant can only be spent on the grant-aided public good, does not have to be at that value, right? Because although they'll have to spend the entirety of the grant on that public good that national government conditions the transfer on, they can divert funding that was going there originally to other activities, right? So it's not like the new the point of tangency, the new equilibrium between the higher indifference curve and the new budget line is going to be in line with EO, right? So it's not horizontally, it doesn't just move horizontally across, right? So the distance between EO or G and M will be smaller than the distance between B and D, right? Because this is now money that's been spent on something that the subnational government was spending on anyway. So they might perceive that, okay, so we've got this grant that we can now allocate to this function. So we can divert some of the resources we were using there and spend it on other things, other public goods and services. Okay. So at point EO, OG is spent on the grant-aided good. At the new equilibrium, there's an increase in expenditure on both the grant-aided public good, but also the non-grant-aided public good. This type of grant is most appropriate to subsidize activities that are considered low priority by subnational governments, but are considered high priority by national governments. Okay. Right. Oh, another point I didn't mention over here is that because of the greater degree of discretion that subnational governments have in the case of a unconditional non-matching grant, this has the lowest, what you might call stimulatory effect on expenditure on the grant-aided public good. Right? In other words, the difference between the value of the grant, BD in this case, and the increase in expenditure on grant-aided public goods, GH in this case, is the largest in the case of unconditional non-matching grants. Okay, over here you're going to have a somewhat bigger difference, a somewhat smaller difference between the grant-aided public good and the change in expenditure between of the grant-aided public good and the the change in expenditure and the original expenditure. The difference between those two will be smaller in the case of a conditional non-matching grant versus an unconditional non-matching grant. Notice that, I mean, the indifference curve can lie up here, right, at this point. It wouldn't be sensible for it to lie on this horizontal line over here. All right. Moving on to open-ended matching grants. Oh, this is one thing that I didn't mention, that matching conditional grants may be open-ended or closed-ended. So an open-ended conditional matching grant is when subnational government pays a proportion of the cost of providing a particular good or service, and the subnational government then contributes the rest of the funding for this good or service. So the grant therefore reduces the cost of that particular public good for the receiving subnational government, and the subnational government can use as much as it wants of the grant as long as it matches the national government's contribution at the state percentage. Okay? So this graph illustrates that that type of grant. So this is a conditional matching grant. In this case, we looked at a conditional non-matching grant. Okay, so the subnational government didn't have to match national government's transfer by some level. In this case, they do. Okay, and therefore, in this instance, you have a pivot of the budget line rather than a parallel shift. Okay, because the subnational government only receives this funding by spending on the grant-aided public good. Right? So it has to raise its expenditure on the grant-aided public good to receive financing from national government to fund that good. Okay, so therefore you have a pivot of the budget line from a B to a D in this instance. So the grant flattens the slope of the budget line and reduces the relative price of the grant-aided public good in this instance. And that incentivizes the subnational government to spend more on that good, right? If the relative price goes down, then you can expect, in theory, subnational government to spend more on that good or service. So as a result of the cost-sharing arrangement, the subnational government can now afford more of the grant-aided good at any level of other public goods, which gives rise to an income and substitution effect. Okay, as you would observe in your in the case of individual consumption, when you have a price change between two goods, right? A price change of one good relative to another. So the income effect means that the subnational government can now afford more of both types of public good, whereas the substitution effect relates the substitution of grant-aided good, spending on a grant-aided good for the other public good, right? So substitution effectively basically means that there will be some degree of substitution of the grant-aided public good relative to the non-grant-aided public goods, due to the fact that it is now cheaper, right? Because it's being subsidized effectively by national government. So the net result of these two effects will determine the position of the new equilibrium. And in this case, we notice that the equilibrium changes from EO to E1, which lies to the right of EO. So there's a huge change in expenditure on the grant-aided public good, right? But generally, both the income and substitution effects will prompt the subnational government to spend more on the grant-aided public good. There can be, one can imagine that there might be that these two effects might contrast, right? Might go in opposite directions, as it sometimes does in the case of the individual example. But in the graph, the substitution effect dominates as less is spent on other public goods at E1, right? So here, less is spent on non-grant-aided public goods post the grant relative to pre the grant. So spending on non-public goods goes down from K to L in this case, and there's a big change spending on grant-aided public good, the grant-aided public good. Okay. Yeah. So, and recall that what the subnational government receives is not BD, right? It's only BD if they spend B on the public good, which of course they won't do. So what they're receiving is this distance over here, right, which is smaller than the change over here, and that is of course being made up by that change from K to L. Okay. So should social preferences be such that E1 ends up to the left of EO, in other words, this equilibrium point lies somewhere up here on this graph, to the left of EO, higher up on the new budget line, then it implies that the grant-aided good is inferior, right? It's called a Giffen good, if I remember correctly. And the income effect dominates the substitution effect with less of the grant-aided good being purchased. So this type of grant is, but that's an unlikely scenario, right? It's unlikely going to be the case that national government wants a subnational government to spend on something that the subnational government really doesn't want to spend on. Right, and this type of grant is appropriate when there are cross-jurisdiction positive externalities that might benefit some national governments who don't bear the cost of providing a good. So we talked about this example previously, where there can be externalities across subnational government jurisdictions, which can, in principle, disincentivize spending on those public goods because citizens outside of the jurisdiction of a given subnational government will benefit from such expenditures. So in the presence of such externalities, SNGs are incentivized not to provide the public good unless it is subsidized. Okay, so in such cases, this would be an efficient way of promoting spending on such goods that carry that externality. One criticism of these grants is that they tend to benefit richer subnational governments that are better able to finance expenditures on the grant good. And this is something that we do see in South Africa as well, where there are certain conditions, not exactly like the example we're giving here, but there are conditions placed on particularly municipalities to undertake some level of expenditure, and then this will unlock a subsidy, a grant from national government to fund further expenditures on that public good or service. And it has been controversial, and to some extent has been diminished. At the same time, it is an important accountability mechanism as well, right? It is important that that municipalities are incentivized to spend on the activities, the goods and services that they are responsible for providing to their constituents. Okay. Okay. Then there's also so this was an open-ended conditional matching grant. Then there's also a closed-ended conditional matching grant. So you can imagine this subnational government maybe deciding they're going to spend this level on they're going to increase the expenditure, say to some point between H and B, right? They're going to go all in on this public good and service, which will then force the national government to provide a much bigger subsidy, right? So the gap between this point and that point, I hope you can see my cursor on the screen, is much larger than the gap between this point and E1, right? And that can result in potential issues for the national government, right? So in the case of a closed-ended conditional matching grant, this is where national governments pay a proportion of the cost for a particular grant for a particular public good, but only up to a certain limit, right? And then the SNG can spend whatever else it wants to, right? So in this case, the budget line pivots out again, but only up to the point C, right? So you have the new budget line given by A, C, D in the case of this grant, but at the kink here at point C, the line becomes parallel once again to the original budget line. Okay. All right. So The slope CD, in this case, of course, equals the slope of AB, right? It's parallel. So cost sharing occurs along the new budget line up to point C, beyond which all further grant expenditure must be self-financed by the subnational government. That's from C to D. So at the new equilibrium point E1, more of the grant-aided good is again provided. So again, we have a shift of equilibrium from E0, E1. So it looks sort of similar to what we observed in the open-ended case. Again, we have the a reduction in expenditure on the non-grant aided good, and of course that is because the subnational government has to spend on the grant aided public good in order to unlock financing from national government in this case, right? Okay. Now, generally these grants are preferred to open-ended ones, and you can imagine why, right? Because it helps the national government have some degree of control over its budget. Okay. In the open-ended case, whatever the subnational government spends, the national government has to match to whatever proportion was predetermined, right? But in the closed-ended case, they match up to some limit, and then beyond that, any further expenditure has to be self-financed. So this closed-ended conditional grant is preferred for national government to, and has the effect of it being able to manage its finances better. Okay. All right, so what is the rationale for intergovernment transfers? And I'll end very soon, okay? We'll just go up to 9:30. The following are some of the main arguments for international government transfers. Fiscal imbalances between expenditure needs and revenue generation capacities of subnational governments are addressed through intergovernment transfers. And I mentioned on various occasions before that there is this mismatch in South Africa between the expenditure requirements, the expenditure sort of duties or obligations imposed on subnational governments, specifically provinces, or to a much greater extent the supplies to provinces and municipalities. And then let me just state that again so that it's clear. There's a mismatch between the expenditure obligations imposed on subnational governments relative to the revenue generation capacity, right, in South Africa. So provinces have to spend on health and education. And both of these activities are not big revenue generators, right? Schools sort of have to manage their finances, their school fees, and so on. But it's school fees for public schools are not sufficient to cover the cost of providing education, particularly at the three bottom quintiles, but even at the fourth and fifth quintile, right? So we talked about quintiles in the previous session, if you recall. And likewise with health, most health services, especially at the primary healthcare level, are costless, depending on the nature of the service and the recipient of the service, and so governments don't raise a lot of revenue by providing these services, yet they are obligated to provide these goods and services, and therefore intergovernment transfers are required for that, right? So the main tax instruments are administered at national level. That's PIT, VAT, CIT, the main revenue generators in the country, all flow to national government, right? So which creates this imbalance between revenue generation versus expenditure obligation. Okay, so conditional non-matching grants are appropriate to ensure minimum standards in the provision of public goods and services for subnational governments, whereas open-ended conditional matching grants can compensate for benefit spillovers, that is spillovers that benefit adjacent jurisdictions in the case of national governments. And closed-ended conditional matching grants are useful when the national government wishes to subsidize a high priority activity undertaken by subnational governments while maintaining control over its own budget. Okay, so I said I'll leave this section self-study, but I'll just go over a few main points briefly. So South Africa's, our intergovernmental system. So we've sort of talked about the structure of government previously. We have these three levels, these three tiers: national government, provincial government, and municipal government. And the functions assigned to the three spheres are prescribed by our constitution. And some of these functions are shared across the spheres, whereas some of them are exclusive to a particular sphere. Example, provincial roads are the responsibility of provinces. Basic education and healthcare are the responsibility of provinces and national government jointly. So most of the policy decisions particularly are undertaken at national level, but also a lot of the expenditure assignment is determined at national level. And something like defense, of course, is generally a national government's responsibility. So concurrent functions, there are functions that have where there's responsibility across the levels of government. Of national and municipal authorities include water, sanitation, while functions like sports facilities, municipal roads are the responsibility of local government. Okay? So Schedules 4 and 5 of the Constitution list the various concurrent and exclusive competencies of the various spheres of government. Please do go and read that. Okay, the Constitution permits provinces to impose taxes, levies, and duties other than income tax, VAT, general sales tax, property taxes, or customs duties. Okay, so that is very restrictive, right? That provision in the Constitution. It's very restrictive in terms of what provinces can do for revenue generation. So a province may now there is a sort of caveat to this. Provinces may levy a flat rate surcharge on the tax base of any tax, levy, or duty imposed by the national legislation, except CIT or VAT, property rates, and custom duties. What this is saying is that provinces can raise an income tax, a personal income tax, but it's somewhat infeasible at present, given our high tax rates. And any province that tries to do this will almost certainly see protest from citizens. And there's a further stipulation that such surcharges must align with national economic policies. So again, there's restraints on what provinces can do, and it must pass the national oversight effectively. Okay, so own revenue raised by provinces or municipalities may not be deducted from the share of nationally raised revenue. This is also stipulated in the Constitution. Provinces may borrow to finance capital expenditure, and no national government guarantee is available in respect of provincial borrowings. This is one of the, provinces generally don't do this. Okay, so even though there is provision made for that, we don't see lots of borrowing undertaken by provinces to finance capital expenditure. Municipalities may impose rates on property and surcharges on fees for services, the main ones being the provision of electricity and water and sanitation. Right? Those are the main revenue generating activities for municipalities other than property taxes. Okay, municipalities may also borrow with the same restrictions applied as provinces. So you might recall the graph I showed you earlier with respect to expenditure. Where was that graph? Here it was. So here we were quite far up in terms of the decentralization of expenditures across government levels. But in the case of revenue generation, we're much lower down, right? So specifically look at the the vertical axis, which indicates subnational government revenue as a share of subnational government tax revenue. as a share of subnational government revenue. So this tells us that subnational governments are only raising less than 10% of their total revenue, right? Which is a very different picture from the expenditure assignment that we saw earlier. Okay. So SNGs are highly reliant on national transfers. This graph shows you grants and subsidies as a proportion of GDP on the horizontal axis, and grants and subsidies as a percentage of subnational government revenue on the vertical axis. And you see it's around 70% of total revenue going to subnational government comes from national government. Much higher in the case of provinces, somewhat lower in the case of municipalities. Okay, so in SA, most taxes are raised at national level, and this facilitates simple administration, right? Through SARS, for instance, in the case of income tax and corporate income tax, duties, etc. And this it resulted in imbalance between revenue assignment and service delivery responsibilities. Okay, I think I should end it here. It's after 9:30 now, and I'm sure you guys have other things to get to, as do I. Just quickly responding to Lunke's question, what is the scope for the module test? Yeah, that will be coming up soon. The scope